The cold that stays now. There's a particular kind of cold in the Texas Panhandle that doesn't just visit. It moves in, puts its boots up, and dares you to do something about it. February of 1887 brought the worst of it. The kind of freeze that crept through cabin walls like it owned the place, coating the inside timbers with frost thick enough to scrape with a thumbnail. The wind came out of the north without mercy and without pause, driving across miles of flat nothing until it hit whatever stood in its path and tried to tear it apart. Caleb Briggs woke to that cold the way he'd woken every morning for 2 weeks running. Coughing. Not the polite kind a man clears with coffee, but the deep, wet, rattling sort that bent him double over the edge of his cot and left him gripping the iron frame like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the living world. His chest burned with each breath. His ribs ached from the constant heaving. The single wool blanket he owned had long since stopped pretending it could keep a man warm in weather like this. He sat up slow, the way old men do, though Caleb Briggs was only 34. 34 and feeling every year of it doubled in his knees, his lungs, and the hollow of his stomach that hadn't seen a proper meal in days. The pantry held a half-sack of cornmeal gone weevily, a tin of lard stretched thin as his patience, and nothing else worth mentioning. He'd eaten the last of the salt pork 4 days back and had been running on black coffee and stubbornness since. Outside, 30 head of cattle stood bunched against the north fence, their backs crusted white with snow, breath rising in clouds that the wind tore apart soon as it formed. 30 head, down from 60 the year before, and 100 the year before that. The land had a way of taking back what it gave, and it had been taken from Caleb Briggs steady for 3 years. He pulled on his boots and coat, stepped onto the porch, and the cold hit him like a closed fist. He coughed again, longer this time, bracing one hand against the doorframe while the other pressed flat against ribs that felt ready to crack. A man with any sense would ride into town, find old Doc Harlan, and get himself looked at proper. But town was 11 miles through open prairie in weather cold enough to freeze the breath in your throat before it left your lips. And Doc Harlan didn't work on credit. Caleb had 17 cents in a tin can on the shelf and pride enough to fill a barn. He squinted across the flat white land, past the cattle yard, past the fence line where the snow lay smooth and undisturbed in every direction. A narrow creek cut through the low ground maybe 200 yards south. Frozen solid now, its banks drifted over with snow. And beyond that creek, set back in a stand of bare cottonwoods, sat a little adobe house with a clay chimney sending a thin line of smoke into the gray sky. He'd seen that smoke every morning and every evening for 2 years. Never walked over, never saw cause to. Folks out here kept to themselves, and Caleb kept to himself more than most. He turned back inside, bolted the door against the wind, and sat down beside a stove, burning the last of his mesquite. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills up a room where a woman's voice used to be. Night came early, the porch was empty, the creek was frozen. Tomorrow would be the same. The first pot. The fever settled in proper on the 4th of February. Caleb knew the date because he'd scratched it on the doorframe that morning with his pocket knife. The way a man marks time when he suspects time might be running short on him. By noon, the cabin walls had started swimming. By mid-afternoon, his hands shook too hard to grip the coffee pot. By dark, he couldn't stand without the whole room tilting sideways beneath his boots like the deck of a ship in rough water. He fed the cattle that afternoon through sheer stubbornness and nothing else. Scattered what hay remained and broke ice on the water trough with an axe handle, each swing sending a cough ripping through his chest that tasted like rust and left him doubled over the trough edge, gasping. The cattle watched him with their patient, dark eyes. They didn't know he was dying by inches. They only knew they were thirsty. By the time he stumbled back to the porch, the sun was already dropping behind the flat edge of the world. and the temperature was falling right along with it. That's when he saw it. A pot, clay, round-bellied, sitting square in the middle of the porch boards like it had every right to be there. Steam curled from beneath a white cloth draped over the top. A clean cloth, hand-hemmed along the edges, folded careful as a letter nobody had written. No note beside it, no footprints he could make out, though the wind had been scouring the snow all day and would have covered tracks within the hour. He looked out into the gathering dark. Nothing moved between his porch and the horizon. No sound but wind and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. Caleb carried the pot inside, set it on the table, and lifted the cloth. Rabbit stew, thick with root vegetables, fragrant with wild onion, still hot enough to burn his fingers on the clay rim. He stood there for a long moment, swaying on his feet, trying to make some kind of sense of it. Then hunger won the argument it always wins. And he ate, Lord, he ate. He ate the way a man eats who has forgotten what warm food feels like in his belly, which he very nearly had. The broth spread through his chest like lantern light filling a dark room, pushing the cold back into the corners where it belonged. He scraped the pot clean with his fingers and sat back, breathing hard, his eyes stinging with something he refused to call tears. The next evening, bean broth, same pot, same cloth, folded the same careful way, same empty porch when he opened the door, same silence where an explanation should have been. He ate it standing over the stove, too grateful and too hungry to bother with a chair. Come morning, he washed both pots until they shone, dried them with his only clean shirt, and set them on the porch before first light. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they were gone. It was the only conversation he knew how to have. A man who won't ask third night. Chicken and dumplings. Caleb sat at his table with the pot between his hands and stared at it the way a man stares at something he can't explain and can't refuse. The dumplings were light, rolled thin and cut square the way a practiced hand makes them. Not the same recipe as Eleanor's. His late wife had never used chili pepper or cilantro, but the same care lived in it. The same hours of standing over a stove, rolling and cutting and watching the pot, that turned simple flour and broth into something that could hold a person together when everything else was coming apart. Eleanor, gone 2 winters now. Pneumonia took her fast, the way the Panhandle took everything, sudden and without asking permission. They'd buried her on the ridge behind the cabin where the wind kept the snow thin. And Caleb had stood there with a shovel in his frozen hands, feeling the last warmth drain out of his life like water through cracked clay. He remembered her hands. Small, rough-knuckled, always moving, kneading biscuit dough at dawn while she hummed something tuneless and sweet. Flour dusting her forearms. The kitchen warm with the smell of lard and coffee. Those hands had fed him every day for 6 years. And he'd never once thought to call it what it was. He just called it supper. Now a stranger's hands were doing the same. And Caleb Briggs sat alone in a cold cabin, understanding for the first time what it cost to feed a man who couldn't feed himself. He could have gone to town, could have asked for help at the church, or knocked on a neighbor's door. If any neighbors remained within riding distance. The drought of '85 had scattered homesteaders across the Panhandle like seeds thrown on rock. The ones who stayed were hard people who understood that asking for help was the first step toward losing what little a man had left. Not the land, not the cattle. The one thing poorer than both. Dignity. So Caleb didn't ask. He ate the chicken and dumplings in silence, washed the pot, and set it on the porch with the cloth folded on top. Then he did something he hadn't done in months. He lit the whale oil lamp and set it in the window. Not an invitation. Not exactly. Just a man tired of sitting in the dark. That night, lying in his cot with the fever pulling at him like an undertow, he listened for footsteps on the porch, heard only wind, But somewhere between waking and sleep, a thought settled in his chest heavier than the cough. He was waiting for the soup now, counting the hours until dark the way a child counts the hours until Christmas. Depending on it. That scared him worse than the sickness ever had. 14 nights. The pots kept coming. Night 4 brought potato broth, thick and salted, with chunks of potato soft enough to melt on a sick man's tongue. Night 5. Beans with a ham hock that must have cost somebody dear at the general store in town. Night 6. Rabbit stew again, richer this time, with wild garlic and a warmth that went deeper than pepper. Nights 7 through 10 blurred together in the fog of fever. He remembered corn chowder, another round of chicken, something with turnips and marrow bones that warmed him so deep he slept straight through to dawn for the first time in a week. Every night the same clean cloth, same careful fold, same absence of explanation. 14 nights. Friends. 14 pots of soup carried through snow and cold by hands he'd never seen. Set on the porch of a man who'd never done a single thing to earn it. Think about that for a moment. Think about what kind of soul walks through a Panhandle winter every evening for 2 straight weeks to feed a stranger, and never once leaves her name. He tried once to catch his benefactor. Night 11. He reckoned. Though the fever had made the days unreliable, he wrapped himself in his coat and sat in the rocker by the frost-clouded window, watching the porch through glass thick with ice crystals. But fever is a patient enemy. It waited for his eyelids to go heavy, waited for the warmth of the last broth to pull him down like an anchor into deep water. And when he startled awake in full dark with a crick in his neck and cold in his bones, the pot was already sitting there, warm, covered, the cloth folded with the same careful hand as always. The soup was keeping him alive, and he knew it plain as he knew his own name. Without those 14 pots of stew and broth and dumplings, the fever would have hollowed him out and the cold would have finished what remained. Whoever was crossing through that snow each night was carrying more than food in that clay pot. She was carrying him through the worst stretch of February cold he could remember, one meal at a time, and asking nothing in return. Meanwhile, his cattle needed tending. Even in the worst of the fever, Caleb dragged himself out each morning to break ice and scatter hay. He moved among them slow and unsteady, one hand on a cow's flank for balance, coughing into his sleeve. The animals pressed close, their warm bodies steaming in the cold air, and he talked to them the way lonely men talk to livestock, low and steady, more for his own comfort than theirs. They depended on him. That was reason enough to keep standing. On the morning after the 14th night, Caleb stepped onto the porch to collect the cleaned pot he'd set out and stopped. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, light and undisturbed except for one thing: boot prints, small ones, pressed firm and deliberate into the white ground. They led from his porch steps down the slope toward the creek, crossing at the narrow place where the stones showed through, and continued in a line straight and purposeful as a fence row toward the little adobe house in the cottonwoods. His heart beat faster than it had in weeks. He had a direction now. Boot prints in the snow. The cough broke on a Tuesday. Caleb woke to something he hadn't heard in weeks. Silence. Not the silence of the cabin, which was its own heavy thing, but silence inside his own chest. No rattle, no burning, no wet, ragged pull when he drew breath. Just the ordinary quiet of a man breathing in a cold room, his lungs working the way lungs are supposed to work, without complaint and without spectacle. He lay still for a long time, testing it, waiting for the cough to ambush him the way it always did, lurking behind a deep breath or a sudden movement. It didn't come. The fever had broken sometime in the night and left him washed clean, wrung out, weak as a newborn calf, but clear-headed for the first time since the 4th of February. He dressed slow. Everything took effort. Buttoning his shirt was a negotiation between his fingers and the fabric that his fingers very nearly lost. Crossing the cabin to the door took the kind of concentrated will that used to carry him across the entire cattle yard without a thought. But he made it outside. And the morning that met him there was different from every morning that had come before it. The sky was scrubbed blue from horizon to horizon. The kind of winter blue that only comes after the worst weather has spent itself. The wind had dropped to a whisper. The cold was still there, still serious, but it had lost its malice. You could breathe without wincing. He followed the boot prints. They led across the yard, down the gentle slope to the creek, and through the narrow crossing where water ran shallow over smooth stones. Not quite frozen, not quite flowing, caught between seasons. On the far bank the prince climbed toward the cottonwoods and ended at the door of the adobe house. Caleb stood at the creek's edge and looked across, really looked. For the first time in 2 years of living within shouting distance. The house was small. 2 rooms, maybe 3. Adobe walls patched neat with fresh mud where the winter had cracked them. A chicken coop built tight against the north wind. 4 brown hens scratching in the sheltered dirt beside it. A garden frame buried under snow. Its cedar posts standing patient and straight. Waiting for spring with the quiet confidence of things that have been through hard seasons before and know another one is coming that will be kinder. And along the west wall, a wood pile, stacked careful, split clean, but thin. Thinner than it should have been in the deep heart of February. Thinner than his own. He sat down. Not a decision. His legs simply folded beneath him and set him down on the creek bank with his boots in the snow and his hands hanging between his knees. He stared at that thin woodpile across the water and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the cough. Whoever lived in that adobe house was not wealthy, was not comfortable, was burning through her winter wood the same way Caleb was burning through his cattle and his pride. One day at a time, hoping the math worked out before spring. And every evening for 2 weeks she had taken from her own kitchen, her own stores, her own firewood hours, and carried it through the snow to a man across the creek who had never once walked over to introduce himself. He wept. Sitting there on the frozen bank with the blue sky above him and the creek murmuring beneath its crust of ice. Caleb Briggs put his face in his hands and wept. Not from sadness. From the weight of a kindness so plain and so heavy he couldn't hold it and couldn't set it down. Pride like a sickness. He tried to write the note 3 times. First attempt, sitting at the table with a pencil stub and the back of an old feed receipt. Thank you kindly, but I can manage now. Please keep your provisions for yourself. He read it back, crumpled the paper and dropped it on the table. The words were true in the way lies sometimes are. Technically accurate and thoroughly dishonest. Second attempt. Ma'am, I am in your debt and would be honored to repay your kindness at the earliest. He stopped writing. Repay with what, 17 cents? 30 cattle he couldn't sell before spring. And a cabin with frost on the inside walls. Third attempt. I know it's you across the creek. I seen the boot prints. He held the pencil over the paper for a long while, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. Then he crumpled this one too and fed all 3 to the stove, where they curled black and vanished without argument. Now, pride's a strange sickness. Maybe the only one worse than what had been in his lungs. It'll let a man starve before it lets him say thank you to someone who saved his life. And Caleb had a case of it severe enough to be terminal. He knew what he should do. Walk across that creek, knock on her door, look her in the eye, and say the plain words. But crossing meant admitting. Admitting meant owing. And owing meant the last wall he'd built around himself. The wall that said, I don't need anybody. I can do this alone. I am sufficient unto myself. Would come down around his ears like rotten fence posts in a January wind. That wall was all he had left that felt like it belonged to him. He spent the afternoon watching the adobe house from his porch. Saw the door open once. A figure in a dark shawl stepped out, moved with quick purpose from house to chicken coop and back, scattering feed with one hand while the other held the shawl tight against the cold. Small, efficient. She moved like someone who didn't waste a single step because she couldn't afford to. He thought about Eleanor, not her death this time, but her voice, something she used to say when he'd work himself half to death rather than ask the neighbor for help with a fence line. The hardest work on any homestead ain't breaking sod or stringing wire. Caleb, it's breaking through a man's fool pride long enough to let somebody love him. That evening the soup came again. Corn chowder, thick and golden, with crumbled bacon on top. He ate every drop. He hated himself for eating it. He loved whoever had made it. He sat at the empty table with the clean pot before him and the war inside him still raging, neither side willing to give ground. The cloth and the choice. The cloth. Caleb sat in the lamplight holding it flat across both palms. The same white cloth that had covered every pot for 14 nights without exception, hand-hemmed with small, even stitches along every edge, washed and pressed between uses, because each evening it came back clean, and each evening it was folded the same way, twice lengthwise, once across, corners matched. Not a single night's variation in 2 full weeks. He raised it to his face. It smelled of wood smoke and clean cotton and something faintly herbal underneath. Yerba buena maybe, or dried cilantro. A kitchen smell. A living smell. The kind of scent that gets woven into cloth when a woman cooks in the same room where she hangs her washing, and the steam of both mingles until you can't separate the feeding from the living from the loving. It's all one thing. Nobody folds a cloth that careful out of duty. Nobody walks through snow for 14 nights out of obligation. Caleb held the cloth and knew this the way he knew the weight of a fence post or the sound of a calf in trouble. Something in him that was older than thought and deeper than reason understood that what he held in his hands was not fabric. It was devotion made visible. The kind of steady, quiet, unrewarded faithfulness that Eleanor would have recognized and that she would have called by its right name without hesitation. Here's what Caleb couldn't have told you then, but I believe he understood somewhere down in the marrow of him. Sometimes the bravest thing a proud man can do is just sit still and let someone be kind to him. He stood up, crossed to the stove, fed the crumpled notes from earlier into the fire and watched them curl and blacken and disappear. Then he went to the trunk at the foot of his cot and opened it for the first time in 2 years. Inside, beneath a folded quilt and a pair of work gloves that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's lavender sachets, was his good shirt. White cotton, bone buttons, ironed flat the last time by hands that were now beneath the frozen ground on the ridge behind the cabin. He lifted it out and held it up. It would need pressing. He heated the iron on the stove and pressed it himself, slow and clumsy. A man doing a task that wasn't his but needed doing. When it was finished, he hung it on the back of the chair where he could see it. Tomorrow evening he would put on that shirt. He would sit on the porch, not in the cabin with the door bolted, not hiding behind pride and silence and frosted glass. He would sit out in the open where she could see him. And when she came, because she would come. She had come every night for 14 nights and she would come again. He would say the 2 words his pride had been choking on since the first pot appeared on his boards. Thank you. He set the lamp in the window. But tonight it wasn't ambiguity. Tonight it was a man standing in the yellow light of his own kitchen, finally ready to be seen. The woman at dusk. Dusk came slow to the Panhandle on the 13th of February. The sky turned from white to lavender to a deep, bruised purple that settled over the flat land like a quilt drawn across a bed at the end of a long day. The wind had died for once. In its absence, the world was so quiet, Caleb could hear the creek murmuring beneath its thinning ice 200 yards away. And beyond that, the faint cluck of chickens settling into their coop for the night. He sat in the rocker on his porch wearing his good shirt under his coat, his hands resting on his knees, his breath making small clouds that hung motionless in the still air before dissolving. The fever was gone. The cough was gone. What remained was a man scoured down to his essentials by 2 weeks of sickness and 2 weeks of mercy he hadn't earned and couldn't repay. Sitting in the cold because he'd made a promise to himself and intended to keep it. He saw her at the edge of dark. She came from the cottonwood stand, crossing the creek at the shallow place where the stones broke the water's surface. A small woman, steady on her feet, wearing a wool rebozo the color of dark clay wrapped around her shoulders and across her chest. She carried the pot in both hands, held out before her the way a person carries something precious. And she walked through the last of the snow with the careful, unhurried steps of someone who had made this crossing many times and knew where every stone lay beneath the surface. She didn't see him until she reached the porch steps. Her eyes lifted from the boards to his face, and she stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Two people meeting across a distance that wasn't measured in yards but in weeks of silence, and all the things that fill silence when kindness is the only language being spoken. "Ma'am." His voice came out rough, rusted from weeks of disuse and something else he didn't have a word for. He cleared his throat. "You been feeding a stranger for 2 weeks. I'd be much obliged if you'd tell me why." She studied him with dark eyes, calm and direct. The eyes of a woman who had made her peace with hard decisions a long time ago and didn't waste energy on regret. She set the pot down on the porch boards between them, straightened her back, and folded her hands at her waist. "Because my mama taught me that a full belly makes a brave heart," she said. Her voice was low, her English careful and precise, shaped by an accent that softened the consonants and gave the vowels a warmth the Panhandle wind couldn't touch. "And you looked like a man who needed both." Something loosened in Caleb's chest, the last rope holding a heavy thing in place letting go. "I reckon I did," he said quietly. "I reckon I surely did." "Esperanza," she said. "I live across the creek. Caleb Briggs." He paused. "I followed your boot prints 3 days back. Shoulda walked over a long time before that. You were sick." "I was something worse than sick, ma'am, but I'm trying to get better." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the ground a smile is built on. The quiet recognition of a man telling the truth about himself for the first time in a long while. He brought the only other chair out from inside. They sat and shared the soup together while the last light drained from the sky and the first stars appeared over the Panhandle. For a moment after the bowls were empty, neither spoke. They sat in the new silence, which was different from the old silence the way a room with 2 people in it is different from a room with 1. Then Caleb asked where she was from, and Esperanza told him Chihuahua, 3 years ago. And the conversation opened the way a door opens when both people on either side of it turn the handle at the same time. She tended a garden, kept chickens, sold eggs in town when weather allowed. She'd seen his chimney smoke go thin and his cattle go unwatered and recognized what that meant, because she had grown up in a house where her mother noticed such things and acted on them without waiting to be asked. Through the open door of the kitchen, Caleb could see the inside of her home, a shelf of books with cracked spines, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the dark vigas overhead, yerba buena and oregano and things he had no name for, a half-finished weaving on a small loom by the window. A whole life, careful and full, lived within these clay walls while he sat 200 yards away pretending the world ended at his fence line. "My mama would have done the same," Esperanza said, reading his silence correctly. "She always said you don't wait to be asked. You just carry the pot. When she left, walking back across the creek in the dark with the empty pot under one arm, Caleb watched from the porch until the lamp lit in her window. Two lights burning now, facing each other across the water like two people at opposite ends of a conversation that had finally, after all this time, begun. Mesquite and creek water. Valentine's Day dawned cold and clear. Same panhandle, same February wind, running flat and sharp across miles of open country. Same cabin on the same hardscrabble homestead with the same 30 head of cattle standing patient against the fence, their breath rising white in the early light. But the man who stepped onto the porch that morning was not the same man who had lain in a fever cot 2.5 weeks before, counting the hours between dark and soup and dark again. Caleb Briggs was dressed, shaved for the first time in weeks, his jaw raw and pink from a blade that needed stropping. His good shirt was buttoned to the collar beneath his coat. His boots were brushed clean. In his hands, he held a bundle of mesquite kindling, 12 good pieces, dry and seasoned and dense with the slow heat that mesquite carries in its grain like a promise. He'd tied them with a length of hemp twine, working the knot careful, the way a man works when the thing he's making is the only thing he has to give and he needs it to say everything. His mouth still can't. It wasn't much. A man with 17 cents to his name and pride enough to nearly kill him doesn't have much to offer. But mesquite burns hot and slow and steady. And in a February where a woman had burned through her own woodpile to cook soup for a stranger every night for 2 weeks, warmth was the most honest gift Caleb Briggs could carry across that creek. He walked to the water's edge. The creek ran shallow and icy over the stones, not quite frozen and not quite free. Caught in that between place where winter still holds on but spring is already pulling at its fingers. Caleb stepped in. The cold shot through his boots and up his shins like a blade, and he sucked air between his teeth and kept walking. The water came up over his ankles, soaked through the leather, numbed his feet to the bone. He didn't stop, didn't slow down. First time in 2 years he'd crossed this creek. 2 years of living a stone's throw from a woman he'd never spoken to until yesterday. Watching her chimney smoke rise every morning and every evening without once walking over to say howdy. All it took was 14 pots of soup and the kind of courage that doesn't carry a gun or ride a fast horse. The kind that carries a clay pot through the snow, steady and careful, night after night, because somebody's mama taught her that you don't wait to be asked. He knocked on her door. Esperanza opened it. She was wearing the clay-colored rebozo, her dark hair braided over one shoulder, and she looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes that had already seen through every wall he'd built and every excuse he'd made and still brought the soup anyway. Caleb held out the kindling. "For your fire, ma'am, it ain't much." She looked at the bundle in his hands, looked at his soaked boots, the creek water darkening the porch boards beneath his feet, looked at his face and whatever she found there. She smiled, a real smile, unhurried and warm, the kind that starts behind the eyes and takes its own sweet time reaching the mouth because it isn't performing for anyone. It's just the truth of a feeling arriving where it can be seen. "It's warm," she said. "That's enough." She stepped aside. He stepped in. Her kitchen smelled of wood smoke and yerba buena and the first pot of the day already simmering on the stove. Enough for two, as if she'd known he was coming before he'd known himself. Now. I can't tell you everything that came after that morning. That's their story to live and theirs to tell. And some things are better left to the people inside them than to a voice on the outside looking in. But I can share this much because it's the part that matters. For the rest of that winter and every winter that followed, there was never a cold night on either side of that creek. Caleb learned to cross it in all weather. Rain and snow and spring mud and summer dust. And Esperanza never once stopped carrying food to his table. Though in time, The distance grew shorter and the porch grew wider, and the two chimneys became one. He gave what he had. She gave what she had. And between them they built the kind of life that doesn't make the history books but makes the world worth living in. Sometimes love doesn't start with a grand declaration or a diamond ring or a ride into some painted sunset. Sometimes it starts with a pot of rabbit stew left on a sick man's porch, covered with a hand-hemmed cloth, no note attached, and it ends. If you're brave enough to cross the creek, with a lifetime of quiet kindnesses passed back and forth like bread at a table where nobody sits alone anymore. Outside, in the February dusk, two thin lines of chimney smoke rose into the still air, one from each side of the creek. They climbed slow and straight in the windless cold, and somewhere above the cottonwoods they drifted together, tangling gently, the way all separate things find their way toward warmth when the wind finally lets them.